Hello, I'm Dean Bertram, and welcome to my weird library. When we talk about UFO belief, or when somebody says they believe in UFOs, what we tend to think that means is a belief in extraterrestrial craft visiting the Earth from another solar system, or at least another planet, and bringing inside them their extraterrestrial crews. And that's pretty much been the stock standard major belief when it comes to UFOs since the late 1940s or early 1950s, when flying saucer culture and flying saucer belief really kicked off. But from the late 1960s into the 70s and also up to today, there's been an alternative strain of thought which really kicked off post-Condon Committee when Jacques Vallee wrote Passport to Magonia, which began to recognize these similarities between UFO lore and UFO experiences and UFO reports with older traditions, notably fairy lore. And that idea was also carried in the following year in John Keel's fantastic, perhaps major work, UFOs Operation Trojan Horse, where he also talked about the similarities to UFO accounts with fairy lore. Now, that idea has been carried through to the present day in this alternative strain of thought, including in Jerome and Loren Coleman's The Unidentified, another fantastic book. In fact, all of these books are great, or I wouldn't be showing them to you, and the idea has been carried in other books as well. In Ted Holliday's and Colin Wilson's The Goblin Universe, which was actually written by Ted Holliday before he died and published posthumously. Of course, Keith Thompson's incredible Angels and Aliens, which this is a fairly beaten up ex-library copy that I have, but a great book. You should get your hands on it. Patrick Harper's wonderful Daemonic Reality, A Field Guide to the Other World, which should be on anybody's bookshelf who's interested in ufology or UFO belief or any type of paranormal or occult or cryptid belief system. And up until the relatively recent present, at least with Joshua Cutchin's, for example, Thieves in the Night, which looks at a history of supernatural child abduction, looking at the commonalities again between, say, alien abductions, meaning grey extraterrestrials, and older fairy faith abductions. And there have been various academics who've looked at this as well. Thomas Bullard comes to mind, but there's many of them who've drawn those parallels between older belief systems of fairies and the like with our current beliefs in extraterrestrial visitation. Now, the book I'm talking about today, it's a wonderful book. It's Mac Tonnies' The CRYPTOTERRESTRIALS, and I just love Anomalous Books, the cover on this. Wonderful, wonderful copy. I mean, the face, which reminds me a little bit of the cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion, but the being here, unlike the being on the Communion cover, which is completely nightmarish and inhuman, this has a sense of, more familiarity with us, something a little more like us, something more like the good neighbours, perhaps, the fair folk, the other crowd. The idea that something lives closer to us is more like us, and perhaps that's part of the reason for the artwork, because what Tonnies suggests is a little bit different to what I spoke about in those earlier books, but still part of the same tradition, I would say. And while some of those books tend to look at the commonalities between modern extraterrestrial UFO reports and older fairy traditions or demonic or demonologies, for example, and suggest that somehow maybe this phenomenon's just reflecting our own ideas. We're in the space age now and have been since really the 1950s. We were heading into it, so that's what we saw. Or in the past, we were more likely to still have superstitious beliefs about goblins or the fair folk or whatever, so that's what we saw. But Tonnies takes a slightly more literal interpretation, and that is, he suggests that there's a genuine cryptoterrestrial race, as the title suggests, and as also as the subtitle suggests, that it's a mediation on indigenous humanoids and the aliens among us. In other words, these things live near us. They live next to us, again, like the other crowd or the good neighbours of fairy faith, implying in the very title that they're here nearby. They're not from a distant solar system. But Tonnies also suggests that perhaps these things are intentionally tricking us, intentionally presenting as extraterrestrial now, because that's what we believe, and whatever their agenda is, they find it worthwhile to put a veneer of something on top of what they appear as, so we will accept them. And Tonnies doesn't get to the root of what he thinks that agenda is, but he suggests that it may be nefarious, it may not be. But what I think is of most value of this book is something that Greg Bishop writes about in the afterwards, or the afterword to the book, and that's that we tend to quite often in the UFO community, in the paranormal community, and I suppose in the cryptid community, be dismissive of armchair experts. But that mightn't be the best way to actually approach any of these phenomena, because it might be the theoreticians that get closer to the truth somehow. And that's certainly what Tonnies was. He wasn't out there interviewing lots of people or out there in the field watching the night skies. Most of his theory was developed upon looking at source materials and the like. And even today, I saw a post recently on Facebook of somebody in the community being very dismissive of people that aren't there in the field doing, investigations with boots on the ground. But all we seem to do when we get that are more reports, which are just this unending pile of stories which don't get us any closer to the mystery. Perhaps a book like this, again, like Greg Bishop suggests, is somehow a way to ferment ideas. It helps us to start to think a little bit outside of the box when it comes to things like UFO phenomena or UFO belief. And certainly when I was reading this book, while Tonnies suggests that maybe these entities, again as I mentioned, are putting on a kind of facade now, they might always have put on a facade to appeal to us or to manifest the way we expect them to manifest. But it made me think maybe once we did see a closer perspective or something closer to the reality of what these creatures were, maybe the creatures of fairy tradition or of older folklores were closer to what these things were. Maybe there was a breakaway type of civilization of another terrestrial but non-human race, and stories about fairy faith certainly suggest this. For example, in Ireland, one of the popular explanations for who the other crowd or the good neighbours or the fair folk are is that there was a race that existed in Ireland previously to the Gaels or the Celts coming over from Spain, and they were called the Tatterdouanan. And when they clashed with the latest wave of invaders, in other words the current Irish stock, they lost, and they essentially went underground, and certain old hills and forts and caverns and perhaps another world just separated from this one by a veil became the home of the Tatterdouanan, or the fair folk now. And we had the daylight, sunlit, physical, above-ground world, and they existed in a reality parallel to ours, or perhaps just underneath, or perhaps just hiding in the old fairy forts. And similarly, there's traditions in Iceland which echoes the very title of this book, CRYPTOTERRESTRIALS. In Iceland, they talk about the hidden folk, which are also meant to be another race that perhaps started at a similar point as we did, but eventually went underground and lived separately to us. Now, admittedly, the Iceland belief might be able to trace itself to the Tatterdouanan belief of Ireland, because apparently a lot of Irish slaves were taken over there by, I suppose, raiding Vikings or whatever that equivalent was from Iceland at the time. So perhaps the old fairy faith travelled to Iceland, but lots of cultures around the world have these ideas of another existing non-human but humanoid species that lives beside us. And for me at least, that's certainly as believable as us being visited by extraterrestrials from, billions of light years away. And so that, I think, is the real value of this book. And I'm just playing with ideas anyway. There mightn't be any such thing as cryptoterrestrials living among us. There mightn't be any such thing as the other crowd or the fair folk. But when we look at ufology and look at its parallels in older traditions, and when we read books like Tonnies' book, our perspective opens beyond just whatever the current mainstream UFO belief of extraterrestrial visitation is. Because let's be honest, those ideas haven't got us any closer since the late 1940s to understanding what this phenomenon or phenomena, there might be multiple things which we just wrap in one phenomenon, actually are. Anyway, thank you for listening to me today, and please like the channel. I'd love it if you left a comment if you enjoyed this little rant of mine. And you can hear me every Saturday night with my co-host Jen Durrell. You can watch us on Talking Weird Live at 11 p.m. Central. So stop by, subscribe to the channel, because both this and Talking Weird are on the YouTube channel that you're watching this on at the moment. And until I talk to you again, keep it weird.